We've just added a table view controller to our project, but what does that really do? Well, a table view controller manages a collection of cells, and again, cells were those different rows that we saw, and it takes care of all the user interaction of scrolling the table up and down, and then selecting a particular row. So the table view controller manages what's going to happen if a user taps on a row. So if I highlight my table view controller and then click on the identity inspector, I can see that right now the class that's managing it is just a default UI table view controller, so nothing special. Since we want to be able to control how many rows there are and what happens when the user taps on a cell, we need to create our own custom class to manage this table view controller. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's hit Command N to get a new project. We're going to make it a Cocoa Touch class. We need to make sure that is a subclass of UI table view controller. So if you have to change this, go ahead and do that, but make sure it's a subclass of UI table view controller, and I'll call this journal table view controller. Hit next. I want to make sure it's in the journal group. Hit create. Actually, I wanted it down here, so let me just move it down into this journal group. And you can see that when I created something that's a subclass of UI table view controller, I get a lot of functions already done for me. For example, I get this number of sections in table view, and a section is just a group of related cells. You could have groups of cells that do different things. And then the number of rows in each of those sections is controlled by this function. And again, we got this because it is a subclass of table view controller, and it's the delegate for that class. So now that I have this, let's go ahead and tell my table view controller that instead of using this default class, I'm going to use my journal table view controller. So when I start typing journal, you can see it fills it in, and I'll hit enter, and now this table view controller is being controlled by this class. Well, you can see I still have a couple of warnings, and one is that icon warning we always get, but the other one says a prototype table cell must have a reuse identifier. And to really get an idea of what that means, let's talk about what a table view controller really does. Okay, so if you've ever used an iPod or an iPhone and have seen like a list of data, like for example, if you're listing the songs that's in your music library, you may have seen rows and rows and rows of song titles, and you're able to use your finger to flick up and down very, very quickly and see a lot of songs move by very, very fast. And again, that's the table view controller handling all that memory management. Okay? And it can display lots and lots of data. And so that data has to come from somewhere, and the table view controller can be the data source, and it can be the delegate. So the delegate controls what happens when a cell is tapped. So if I tapped one of these rows here, obviously something's going to happen, and it's the table view controller that determines that. So it can do both, which is a pretty cool thing. One of the other things that's really important that the table view controller does is it handles displaying the data and how that data is displayed. And it does not keep, if you have like say 1,000 songs in your library, it doesn't keep all 1,000 in memory at the same time. That could pretty much cripple your phone. What it does is when a cell moves off the screen, it's reused. So it erases the data from that, puts it down near the right off screen, so it's the next one that shows up, and it obviously goes very, very quickly. So when a table moves on or off, when a cell moves on or off the screen, it gets reused. So it saves memory. And so in order for it to do that, it needs what's called a reuse identifier, so it can identify those cells. So that's the error we're getting. Prototype table cells must have a reuse identifier. Let's go ahead and fix that error now. So I'm going to click on my prototype cell, and I'm going to go to my attributes inspector, and you see there's a reuse identifier block here. I'm going to call it a journal cell, or sorry, journal entry cell, because each one of these rows will contain a journal entry. And again, it doesn't matter what you call it, though it should be relevant and descriptive, but it's just a way for Xcode to identify and control the cells. And you notice that the error disappears once I give it an identifier. So let's go back to my project listing here, and I'm going to go to my table view controller. I'm going to add a little bit of code. I'm going to create a property at the top, cell reuse identifier equals journal entry cell. And again, I do this at the top so that if I have to change the name of this, I only have to do it in one spot, and I'll use this property here throughout my code when referring to that cell. So I want to look at one other thing. I'm going to go back to my main storyboard and open this. And we talked about a table view controller being both a data source and a delegate. And we can see that if I control click or right click on my table view controller, I see that it is the data source and the delegate. And in doing so, I get some of these standard functions we saw earlier, like number of sections in table view and the number of rows in each of those sections. So really, I want to have one section in my table view, and the section will contain all the different journal entries. Even though it's one section, it may be hundreds or thousands of journal entries eventually. And for my table view, the number of rows in that section, well, I'm not really sure because it really depends on how many journal entries I have. So I'm just going to go ahead and take out this comment and put to do. This is determined by the number of journal entries. So I have to find some way of saying that the number of rows is the same number of journal entries. And then I have one other thing I want to do. I want to go ahead and uncomment this function, which is the cell for row at index path. And what this does, this allows me to configure what the cell looks like. If I want to have an image with it, what I want the text of the cell to be. I want to go ahead and take out this reuse identifier because it's hard-coded, and I want to use the property here, cell reuse identifier. And so in later lessons, we're going to configure this so that the text in here is exactly what I want it to be, and I can change that. Let's go ahead and run this one time. And you can see I still have blank cells. I can scroll through, but I don't have any errors anymore. So in the next lesson, we're going to go ahead and start adding some data to our table and begin to build our journal project.